communist on the faculty of one university is one communist too many. And even if there are only one communist in the State Department, that would still be one communist too many.
You are, of course, one of the most controversial figures we've had in the Senate in a long time. And you have the distinction of having coined a new word for the dictionary, namely McCarthyism. Now, how do you define McCarthyism, say?
Apparently, McCarthyism means calling a man a communist who is later proven to be one.
Well, I remember the McCarthy period when I was in college. That's when it started, and the McCarthyism was so powerful, and it affected everything because the Korean War was going on. And in 1952, McCarthy was the dominant figure in American life. He was the most powerful person in American public life.
At this instant, the Imperial German government secretly financed the return to Russia of 7 communist exiles led by Nikolai Lenin. Exiles who had been forced to flee the country. And in 100 days, those 7 communists were literally the masters of Russia.
I think he was sort of a populist politician who latched on to an issue and found it ran away with him.
If there were no communists in our government, why did we delay for 18 months? Delay our research on the hydrogen bomb, even though our intelligence agencies were reporting day after day that the Russians were feverishly pushing their development of the H-bomb. And I ask you, who caused it? Was it loyal Americans or was it traitors in our government?
He learned the advantages of the big lie. You don't tell a little lie, nobody cares. You don't say, I think that there's a suspicious man at the grocery store. You say the State Department is full of Russian communists. The army is infiltrated by communists. You make big lies, and that's what he instinctively understood.
Isn't that nasty McCarthy an awful man?
Oh, yes. Basically everything you've ever heard about McCarthy, you just have to hit the delete button on. It's stunning, all the lies that are out there. I mean, there are high school history books, and their entire summary of McCarthy is he was a liar. Not just an ordinary liar, a big liar, a huge liar, a total liar.
You know, if he was half as bad as they claim he is, I'd have never worked for the guy. I've been an honorable man. I was an FBI agent. I was an honorable guy. I was in the military. I wouldn't work for a guy if he was that bad that they say he was.
You'll learn early in life that you don't go skunk hunting with striped trousers, a silk handkerchief, and a top hat. We like what you are trying to do, but, oh, we don't like your method. I've heard that over and over and over like a broken phonograph record. We're engaged now in digging out a much smellier breed of animal than I dug out back on the farm.
I looked at the senator as a little old farm boy from Wisconsin. And you know, they say you can take the little boy away from the farm, but you never take the farm away from the boy. And he was just a big grown-up farmer.
Appleton, boy, where do you start? I'm a hometown boy. I married a hometown girl and stayed home. And this is a wonderful community to raise a family, make a living, religious community, very ground Midwest values.
It was like Pleasantville. It was homogeneous. There were no blacks. There was this unwritten law that they couldn't stay in town. You know, it was a great place if you happened to be white and you know, of middle class, but if you weren't that, it wasn't the place for you.
McCarthy was a farm boy. The farm buildings are still there west of Appleton. one of several children born to a perfectly average, normal Catholic parents. I interviewed a brother, and the brother who looked just like him was perfectly normal and had spent his life as a manual laborer up in the area, and Joe might have too, except that Joe was really smart and aggressive and outgoing and good-looking and ambitious. He had it planned, he had it worked out to become a judge and then to move to the Senate. And the only way he could do that was through the Republican Party.
Correspondent with the Marine Corps, and I'd been a newspaperman before the war. And he said, "Hey, Penn, do you think that you could dream up some kind of a story when the war is over and I go into politics?" And I said, "Joe, there's an old rule in the newspaper business. You can't write a story about it if you don't do something. Now, you're sitting around here and you're a nice fellow, but you're not doing anything." And he came back to me a few days later, and I've been talking to my squadron leader, and he said that it would be okay for me to ride the rear seat in the dive bombers and to make some direct observations as an intelligence officer. I promised not to even try to shoot the gun so I don't shoot the tails off the plane. And I said, "Well, that sounds promising. Why don't you do it?"
McCarthy, being a farmer, having been a young judge there, having been served in the military during World War II, he's in the Marine Corps. He falsified his record, but that's not the story entirely. But he did serve in the Pacific, so he came back as the war hero.
My mother was Senator Joe McCarthy's older sister, and I'm going to read a letter that he wrote to her. It was dated May 8th, 1944, and he was stationed in the South Pacific at the time as a captain in the U.S. Marines. "Dear Sis, Romy tells me that you have quit your job to devote full time to the campaign." This was his first campaign for the U.S. Senate. "You are really a jewel, Sis. I know things look like hell, but if only we can get out the 800,000 letters, I shall win by a landslide. They can't possibly beat us, Sis. If everyone in the state gets a letter and a folder."
Well, you know, Washington, D.C. is really a cruel town. It really is a cruel town. And Harry Truman, President Truman, once said, "If you want a friend in Washington, get a dog."
After 2 years, he wasn't going anywhere, and he was in deep trouble of not being reelected.
He tried to make a name for himself. He got involved in housing after the war and tried to create some legislation that he could put his name on. Nothing seemed to work. There was a Red Scare going on, so from 1948 on at least. You could see it in 46 growing. Joe didn't really pay any attention to it. He would call the occasional left-wing critic a commie. Everybody, you know, and that was typical language in the Republican Party in those days, but he didn't get involved in it at all. And then he was invited to make a tour, and there he just gave some typical blowhard stuff in a speech in Ουίλινγκ, West Virginia, in which he said there were commies all over the State Department, 205 of them, and he knew their names. He didn't have any names. This was sheer nonsense. It was McCarthy's Irish bravado.
During this speech, his exact words were, "Right at this moment, right this instant, our government is being infiltrated by communists." He repeated it the second time, and the audience were just amazed. I don't think any of us in Ουίλινγκ ever heard the word communist before.
Right after he left Ουίλινγκ, He flew to a bunch of other little cities to give talks, and everywhere he went, the reporters were flocking around him saying, where's the documentation for 205 Reds in the State Department? Well, I left it in my briefcase in the plane. I mean, that's the kind of audacity that no one else had, let alone a United States senator. Nixon was too smart for such stuff.
The subject of communism was not on Joe McCarthy's screen before he became a politician. I think it became an issue that he identified as something that maybe would project him in the job as a United States Senator.
Best of my recollection, he looked me up. He was a freshman senator. He wanted publicity. He knew that the column was well read. There was a Republican policy meeting, a meeting that was supposed to be secret, a meeting that the newsmen were not supposed to know about. He'd put me on an extension, and he'd call Senator Robert Taft, the Republican leader, and senator to senator ask him what happened. And Robert Taft, thinking that he was talking to a fellow senator, would tell him what happened, and I would be able to get the entire story. He would tell me almost anything that I wanted to know.
Every reporter realized that he was not terribly serious about this, but using them, but they were perfectly willing to be used. It wasn't really motivated by a fear of communism, but by an attempt to use the fear and dislike of communism to destroy other people's civil liberties and to advance one's own career.
Of the most confidential, highly secret State Department documents. This microfilm was made for the purpose of transmitting these documents in reduced form to the Soviet Union.
Richard Nixon gets a lot of credit for the Al-Jarhis hearings. Joe McCarthy had nothing whatsoever to do with Al-Jarhis hearings. He had nothing whatsoever to do with the Hollywood 10. And I could go on and on. And without a doubt, whenever you talk about that issues, they tied in with Joe McCarthy.
Joe McCarthy would not have succeeded had there not been threats to America, had there not been traitors within, had atomic secrets not been given away, had there not been a war in Korea, had the Chinese and the Russians not gathered together.
Well, I think it's a very interesting question, the difference between Nixon, who, quote, got Al-Jarhis, and Joe McCarthy. Nixon was a much more prudent man, much more careful man, particularly as he got along in his career, whereas Joe, that was not one of his major virtues.
Totally different. Nixon was, despite everything that is said about him, a man of a lot of intellectual quality. He was a politician who learned, against his nature, how to use public opinion.
Nixon was, in fact, the model for Joe McCarthy, but he wasn't the only one. The whole Republican Party had figured that they were going to come back to power by attacking the Democrats as being liberal, communistic, socialistic, and traitorous. That was their theme.
Some of the important members of the present administration, through stupidity or design, have coddled communists.
Thank you very much for the privilege of discussing with you this afternoon the great overshadowing evil, which is the issue of 1952. Shall America continue to squander her blood, waste her resources, and sacrifice her position of world leadership? Now, this is not a Republican issue.